Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever live streaming of a panel discussion on the recently read budget speech of the Honourable Minister of Finance, Mr. Kali Schletwijn. This is a collaborative effort between Simonis and Nedbank Namibia, supported by the Namibian newspaper. My name is Bruce Hansen. Budget day was always going to be a challenge of balancing limited fiscal capacity with the need to make politically tough decisions. It is therefore key for us to identify potential outcomes of the budget speech and what these signals about the road ahead. So in the next 45 minutes, our panelists will share their views on the budget and try to analyze those potential outcomes we've just mentioned. So may I introduce to you Mrs. Britt du Plessis. She's the head of business banking at Nedbank. Mr. Megameno Shetunyenga, who is the head of research and dealing at Simonis. Dr. Edward Eddie Turner, also from Nedbank, and Miss Indeleni Nangonga, economist at Simonis. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to you. So let me start off by maybe just quoting what the minister has said about the budget. He said something about that the budget table is aimed at a three-linked and interconnected fiscal policy action. Number one was the growth stimulus package, and that speaks to the fact that the development budget has increased with 42%. He also spoke about the continued reduction in the budget deficit. And number three, which I like the most, is the timely implementation of enabling structural reforms, ease of doing business, business confidence, and increased policy certainty. So what I would like to do is, by way of an opening remark, I would like to ask my panelists, what stood out for you in this budget? Were there any surprises? Was it just something that, we knew that the minister will say that? So anyone?
Yes, yeah, if I can start. In terms of the third point on the policy certainty, and I made notes as we continued, and I at least made about 8 different notes which stood out. And good things that is coming from it, but we need to see how it would actually pan out, is that during this year, NEF, the equity economic framework, will be finalized. Okay. So, and what we also heard is that there would be compromises in terms of the initial one. That would also apply to the Investment Promotion Act. And as we know, there was a lot of kickback against the initial bill. Right. So if we can see positive movement in terms of that, then we can get more investment into the country, we can get more revenue, we can get more tax, we can get an improvement.
Okay. Good. What about you?
Yes, what stood out for me was that the minister said that he wants to avoid the risk in the slowing economy recovery through introducing additional tax rates or increasing those rates or looking at the deductibility of certain items, that they're actually looking at the economy and at the individuals and looking after us seeing that the economy is at a downturn and that they have decided not to increase tax rates, which is quite commendable.
Okay. Anything from your side, Ndeleni?
Well, interesting for me is if you look at your debt to GDP number, what the minister has highlighted is that we should look towards reducing our debt to GDP. But if you look at the numbers, it's actually contradicting to what he's saying. Initially, our budget, our debt to GDP is ceiling is about 35%. But if you look at what is being projected, an increase to 52% is quite a lot. And now I'm just beginning to wonder whether we'll really get back to the 35%, or are we looking at another target?
I would like to dig into that a little bit later. So thank you very much. Megameno.
I think from my side, a neutral budget, some positive and some more the same, really points to take out. And I mean, if you look at, the Lumno budget going up by almost more than 30%, I think that's positive. But again, I mean, you have, the same old wage bill being indicated as unsustainable, but not really specific items to tackle that. So, yeah, And I think there's quite a lot that was said, but I guess it will all fall onto implementation. So I would say neutral.
Neutral.
Yeah.
Okay. It's an interesting choice, choice of words. So, Britt, when I look at the budget, what I do see is that, or what I'm looking out for is all the tax proposals. And I think the man on the street, that's the thing that the man on the street focuses on, and say, wanting to know, how will this affect my pocket. So tell us about because I remember with last year's budget, I remember that there were, if I look at this year's proposals, some of those proposals were also in last year's budget. So is it more of the same, or are there any changes?
Most of the proposals are exactly the same as in the previous year. We had one or two that were added. The interesting one was that the zero rating of sugar was removed, and that was actually something that stood out for me. It didn't really make sense to me, except that maybe the minister's looking after the health of the nation, I don't know.
Yep.
So it's something that stood out that wasn't there before. And the rest was quite the same. It's
So if
nothing has been implemented as we expected. Yes.
So I'm hearing already early in the program, I'm hearing implementing, and I would like us to also explore that, because I think in my mind, if I look at the budget, and I'm not one of the panelists, but if I look at the budget, I'm also wondering why do we have so many of those initiatives in last year's budget? We still have them in this year's budget. Right. So something must be said. Something must be said about that. So Eddie, just from a business perspective and a man on the street perspective, I suppose it's a good thing that we have not readjusted the income tax brackets. So talk to us a little bit about what is your fear as a businessman when the budget is tabled.
Yeah, and Bruce, I'll talk from my perspective. And in Nedbank, I'm the head of corporate and investment banking. And we obviously look for opportunities to finance businesses for growth. In my space, the corporates. But if I can first talk about businesses in general, if you look at the SMEs, there was a good reference to the SME financing strategy, which was started to become implemented, and with 110 million allocated to that. Which I think is a good thing, because we know in the end the future of business is very much reliant on our small businesses gets the opportunity to grow. In terms of the bigger businesses, my concern is we need incentives for big business to invest. Now, it's good to say compromises were made on the front of your NIF and also your Investment Promotion Act.
Yes.
But now with the manufacturing tax incentive, which will be scrapped in terms of the budget speech, that is a concern, because where do you get your big growth from? One of the sectors for a development economy is your manufacturing industry.
Let me interject here. You talked about SME and the SME strategy. So what we've seen over the last couple of years is that a very crucial component of SMEs is the VAT payments that are outstanding, the VAT payments that are being delayed.
Yeah.
So if we talk about the SME strategy, I just can't see, can you marry those things for me? There's an SME strategy, but yet on the ground, something different happens.
Yeah. If I can just go back to my knowledge about the South African tax system, they have a system which they refined in terms of the size of your revenue. So let's leave that as it is, and for all businesses, and you need to go through the process of claiming and getting your claim paid. But in terms of getting an incentive, if you have like a turnover of below 1 or 2 or 5 million, that you pay a lower rate of tax, that is definitely something to consider, or to have a flat rate which is based on your revenue. That may be an incentive, and it will also decrease the admin burden on those businesses to be compliant, tax compliant.
Good. Indaleni. Now, we have not increased, we have not tempered with the income tax bracket, but other taxes were increased. So talk to me from just a economic point of view, but also from a consumer point of view. Is it, is the one playing off the other one? What's happening here?
I think it was definitely one playing off the other one. If you look at, for instance, the few levies that have been increased, so this is the second increase of 25 cents per litre, making it 50 from last year's increase. Now, we already know that our consumers are under distress, and it seems like your few levies and your sin taxes are the easy ones that you can implement without necessarily getting a public rejection on them. But then what we don't look at is the effect on those increases. For instance, last year we had taxis already crying out for increase in taxi fare, and they got that. And I mean, the increases in fuel levies are just an additional burden that could lead to further cost increases to the public. In terms of sin tax, I think I'm going to put it much more simple. If you look at a normal household or somebody that consumes your beer or takes cigarette, so what they do is, or let me maybe just take you back to what is the definition or why you would implement sin tax.
So you're talking about is it your own household or just a typical household?
Just a typical average household. So the reason why you implement sin tax is to reduce the consumption thereof. But then that's not actually what happens on the ground if you look at the product that we're looking at. So what happens is this average household, whoever drinks or whoever smokes, then reduces the expenditure on your basic necessity for children, for the average household, and rather spend much more on your alcoholic beverages, not necessarily that they're stopping consuming. So again, that's just putting additional pressure on the rest of the household.
So I would like the Namibian public to tell me whether that is a standard in the Namibian households that you spend more on your sin products than on the basic necessities. So in the Leni, I'm looking forward to someone responding to that one. But I want to now focus on the revenue side of the budget, because I've always been of the opinion that Namibia struggles with the revenue side of the equation. Now, I'm not saying that we don't struggle on the expenditure side, because the expenditure is easy, because you can just spend, and you continue spending. But on revenue, you need to actually earn. You need to do. There's a bigger effort to increase the revenue. So talk to us about what are the main sources of revenue. What is the biggest source? And then I just need to tell. Can you also explain to us? You've done a study in your latest report, revenue estimates. Can you also tell us a little bit about that revenue estimate versus what the minister has spoken about? And if there's a difference, why the difference?
So maybe just to give a split of what your tax revenue is made up of. So the biggest thereof is your SACCO revenue, your SACCO receipts. Then you have your domestic taxes on goods and services. And in addition to that, you have your income tax and your corporate tax. But then the biggest thereof is obviously our SACCO revenue, which is now projected to surprise to the upside in the current financial period. Now, what's interesting is if you look at our budget projection, initially we projected the revenue to undershoot. That's by 4.2%. But surprisingly, the revenue was more in line with what MOF has projected initially. But then just to look at where the difference came in, it seems like there was an increase in your income tax, and just to maybe to refresh back on what happened during 2018-2019 is that you had your tax amnesty. It seems like that is what has boosted your income tax from individuals. But other than that, if you look at your SACCO revenue still remains in line. If you look at in line with projections, if you look at your VAT also in line with projections. So really the main difference came from increase in your income tax due to this tax amnesty.
Okay. Mega.
Yes.
Just in terms of revenue, we've heard in the newspapers, and I suppose in the corridors we hear about threats to those revenue sources. Are they imminent threats? Are they real threats? So maybe if you can just tell us a little bit about let's say for instance SACCO, because I understand that SACCO, from what the minister has said, I understand that SACCO revenue has bolstered the figures. Is that something that's under threat?
I mean, surprisingly enough, actually, not really, because I mean, we're looking at about we're looking at about 3.4, 3.5 billion upside, you know, in SACCO revenue, which is actually, you know, surprising to the upside. And I mean, if you compare to also the SA budget, you know, on SACCO specifically, I mean, that number is actually looking quite aggressively as well. But the risk to that is that, I mean, we have seen that in the past as well, that being adjusted downward.
Yes.
And again, I mean, it's again, we must recognize that, I mean, it's on the back of, you know, growth, you know, coming through, you know, in both Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Eswatini, and Lesotho. So, as much as I think it's positive, we must, I think, approach it with caution. And I think on the other side, if you talk about individual tax income and corporate tax, I think individual tax income, the changes in the bracket, it's not coming through, so we would potentially not see an increase on that side, because, and I mean, we all know that, I mean, from an employment point of view, I think there's quite a lot of challenges there. I mean, in fact, there's quite a lot of layoffs. And on the corporate side, I think there we might get a bit of surprise downside, especially on the taxes that are proposed that could potentially come through.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Because and you need to now tell me whether I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I think I heard the minister saying that, you know, during this year, probably in the latter part of the year, that we'll see that we come out of the recession. I'm not sure whether that was what I heard correctly. So I want to, because you're talking about, you know, there might be a threat, there might be a risk there, but the minister seems to be a little bit more positive.
Yeah, I think what was forecasted for this year is about a 1.5% growth, and for next year, 2.2% growth, which if you look at some other economists in the country, they would probably say it's closer to a 1%. But yeah, be that as it may, the difference between 1 and 2 in our current scenario will not actually be that significant, because we really need a growth of 5% and more to have a decrease in poverty and unemployment and all the other challenges that we have.
Okay.
I'm quite still pessimistic in terms of growth expectations, especially for South Africa or just the SACCO region in general. Because if you look at globally, I mean, global demand is going down. Global growth is expected to even slow much more than anticipated. And I mean, if you look at in comparison to the growth of in 2018, South Africa is only expected to grow at a 1.5%. That's quite below average. And if you look at Namibia and projections below 1%, that's still way below the average of which we used to see above 4%. So in terms of growth, I'm not seeing that coming through, and that's why I'm still a little bit pessimistic with regards to significant upside in terms of SACCO revenue.
So what was your estimate, your revenue estimate from Simonis?
So we estimated about a 54 billion in terms of revenue.
Versus the minister?
Versus the minister's 56. And so like I said in the beginning, the upside to the minister's one is much more due to your tax MSC, which we didn't put into our numbers.
Okay. Britt, I would like to come back to you. So I want to talk about NAMRA, right? Because we are talking about revenue, and since we have not had any increases in our personal income tax, I would probably venture to say that NAMRA will now become that vehicle that will broaden and deepen the tax base. And maybe that was one reason why that personal income tax was not increased. I'm speculating. But I would like you to give me your view on NAMRA, and how will this change the current revenue regime?
So NAMRA's board was appointed last year in December, and there's quite a few competent individuals in that board. They are busy looking at appointing a CEO for NAMRA. I think if the processes are looked at and collections are looked at, lifestyle audits are done, transfer pricing audits are done, I think our collection will increase, tax revenue will increase with that, and so I think it's a positive thing, and I just wanted to come through. It was supposed to come through some time ago. It's just not happening, so I'm hoping it will not be delayed further than what October 2019, which is hit now. So I think it's positive, but it needs to happen.
I think that was one of the things that I applauded when I did my review in terms of bringing on NAMRA, because I mean, if you look at the purpose for the establishment, they're quite good. Looking at administration reform, reassessment, better tax collection. I mean, those are things that we need in the current economic environment, especially with the revenue being lower, although within expectation. So for me, it being pushed to 1st of October was quite surprising, and I'm not so sure anymore.
Are you now a bit more negative?
But more negative, I'm not so sure whether it will still be pushed out, but the possibility, I will leave the possibility open.
And I think the proof is in the pudding, right? The implementation needs to, come through. And again, I think, as my fellow panelists have indicated, I think it's a good initiative, but are we going to see the fruit of it? I think that's a wait and see.
Okay. Because I would like to throw a spanner into the works. This is another public enterprise. Now, our history with public enterprises. My question is this not just another beast that we are now, that we're setting up with bureaucracy, bloated salaries, and inefficiencies? Now, I want to applaud the fact that we started with the initiative, and it seems it has gained momentum. But we've been talking about this implementation, and now we're sitting again. So, Eddie, I don't know if you have any feelings, any views around that.
I think it's important for us to realize that although we in general would say there's more efficiencies in the public sector compared to the private sector because you have a different kind of governance setup, one also needs to realize, if we just look at the history of the Southern African environment, we had a Steinhoff, which was not public sector. And then we know about Eskom, which is SOE. And we also have our own stories. So what's happening in some countries is that they create what they call a corruption code or anti-corruption code. I think that's probably something that we need to, from a dual perspective, so practically, and get people from private and public sector, sit together and develop a one-page code on what the entities want to comply with and what they actually publicly declare. And okay, the details of that can be worked out. But it's important for a country, if we want to have accountability, and if we really want to influence our kids and demonstrate to them that we want a corruption-free country, as the Honourable Minister reiterated, then we need some kind of code, and we need to go public. It's like a gender violence thing. You need to publicly state, this is what we're going to counter.
I've heard that word, accountability. I've heard that a lot. Accountability, accountability, accountability. Yet I still remain very skeptic about that accountability. So before I dwell into that, maybe Britt, we now have a new tax software. It was supposed to be implemented in July 2018. It has been implemented in January 2018. And I think what I'm hearing from the streets is that it's quite difficult to either register, and if you do register, the things that follow after that. I think you have a bit of experience in that. So talk to us about it. Now remember, and I think also to the general public, we are not here to point fingers. I think what we're trying to do is we're just trying to highlight some of those issues that are probably not as public as they should be. Right? So if I talk about NAMRA and I talk about, maybe it's just another public enterprise, I'm playing devil's advocate because it is a positive thing. So great in terms of establishing it. But how do we now make sure that it's actually working?
Yeah, I think ITA, as it's called, I think it's a great initiative, but in my view, it should have been tested a lot more extensively, maybe with the public, like a pilot run or something. Some of the information and data that was on the old system actually didn't go over to the new system. So a lot information was lost, not a lot, but it's crucial information that was lost. It's extremely difficult for a taxpayer to link themselves on the system. You need obviously your tax number, but then you have to add a 0 in front of it. If you have to add your ID number, it must be your old ID number, not your current one. Most of us don't even remember our old ID numbers. Then you have to phone in and find out what is your old ID number. So it's extremely difficult. Once you're on it, I think it's quite nice. It's quite a nice system once you're on it. If there's not old information of yours that's now outstanding, which was never outstanding before. So I think if all those errors have been ironed out and they fixed it, I think it's an awesome asset to our country to have it. It's a great system. It's just how it was.
Yeah. And so maybe we should, once again, I think you mentioned it, Eddie, once again start talking about the skills deficit, the competency and the capability that we have. And sometimes it's good to realize and to recognize that we might not have all of that. And so it's not a bad thing to bring in the competency and the capability from outside.
Bruce, I mean, I don't know if we've got quite a lot of competent people in Namibia that want to help, that want to assist. And it's just for the ministry to ask. They have asked in the last year for input from the public. So it's much better than what it was. So I think we have quite a lot of competent people in the country that could help with this system as well.
Collaboration.
Yeah.
So I brought that in because that's part of this whole, we need to improve our revenue collection. And that is part of it. Megamenu, we've talked about the revenue. Can we talk about the expenditure?
Yes.
Tell me about the expenditure. Tell me about, why are we spending? It seems like we are spending. And we're spending much more than what we are earning. Talk to me about that, and I would like you to also reference what your estimation was in terms of your expenditure number.
Yeah. So as I indicated earlier, I mean, I think the government is caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, where they still need to continue on their consolidation path, while they need to spur growth. I mean, the economy is under pressure. So obviously, I mean, we're seeing that coming through expenditure, with developmental expenditure going up by almost 42% to 7.9 billion. Well, I think that's positive. And I mean, this is specifically earmarked for infrastructure, right? But I wonder whether this is not one of those that when we get to MTEF or midterm year, that we will get again reallocation from developmental side to operational. So I think that's one point. And again, I mean, we're talking about the wage bill being unsustainable, right? And we're also talking about spending onto the projects that will generate revenue in the future. And I think that's the route we must take. And I'm actually quite surprised with the execution rate as well. I mean, relatively still low. I mean, at 80%.
You're talking about the development budget execution rate.
Yes, 80% compared to operational, which is almost 100%, right? So I guess we also have to up that to ensure really that, as I mean, the minister has highlighted that we need soft, implementation on that side as well. So, and then on the total number, I mean, we expected expenditure, especially for 1920, to remain flat. But I mean, as I indicated, I mean, that's now up to 66.5 billion versus our 65.6 billion. So roughly 1 billion higher. But I think we must give credit where it's due. I think it's for the good cause.
It's for a good cause.
Yes.
Delaney?
Like for me, if you look at obviously keeping expenditure in line with estimation, but the 1 billion up in terms of expenditure for 2019-2020, I think it's more based on we are in an election year. So I believe that that it has to do with the increase in expenditure. But then if you also look at the debt servicing cost, that seems to be increasing. So part of that increase in expenditure could be also due to the addition in debt servicing cost. Obviously widening your deficit even just further. So I think they did well in terms of expenditure. It wasn't a significant increase, although it's an increase. However, it is contradicting with the fact that we are consolidating.
Yeah.
Contradicting? Sorry.
Yeah, I think if we look at the numbers, our debt to GDP forecasted is around about 47, and then the forecast going up to 21, 22 is about 52. And there's no indication if we're going to return to the benchmark of 35. And there was no indication of how do we project beyond 2022, because that is a concern if you look at your global rating agencies. And that's definitely something they're looking at. So one need to be mindful of that, and as Indaleni said, it's an election year, so it is, in a certain sense, it is an election budget with a significant growth in development budget, because you need to create jobs and construction and sustainability on that side, but you also need to sustain your public wage bill. And so we're in a bit of a catch-22, and therefore, and to go back to my previous point, I think the important thing is I missed more stimulation for big business.
Big business. You wanted to say something? Okay. So let me quickly, we also have our viewers texting us and asking us questions. I have one question here, and it's on the deficit. So let me just read that. I want to hear more on the deficit. I'm more worried about the deficit and what it means for the ordinary Namibian. So what does this deficit mean? If you have a budget deficit, and let me turn to the economists. If you have a budget deficit, and then what I'll do is I'll turn to this side, because you also have your own budget, personal budget. I'm not saying it's in a deficit, I'm just saying that you have it. And I also want you just to think about that. But let me ask you, budget deficit, is it something that is bad? Should we worry about it?
Look, if you look at the countries that...
What does your economic theory tell you?
In terms of economic theory, obviously, your deficit is your expenditure that is way above what you collect in terms of revenue. So for me, I think the deficit number, if you look at the projections even going forward, still remains wide, about over 8 billion budget deficit that's expected. And I did a breakdown of what really comprises of this deficit. And if you look at the actual deficit that we incur in the economy, that's just looking at our expenditure and revenue, and you exclude all the statutory costs, you notice that our deficit is actually just approximately 2 billion. But then you have about an 8 billion deficit overall. So what really makes up that deficit is your debt servicing cost. And it seems like that is on an upward trajectory. If you look at the forecast for in the current budget, your debt servicing costs remain above the ceiling, which is at 11% versus your benchmark of 10%. Okay. So I think that is quite worrisome. And that's why we're seeing debt just continuously increasing, because some way, somehow, we need to...
So let me really understand this. You say 2 billion, that's our budget deficit.
That's
the actual budget deficit.
Yes.
But, what is it, 8 billion you mentioned now?
Yes.
Is that the total? Or is
That's the total.
Yeah.
So and the 6 billion? Tell me about the 6 billion. What is the 6 billion?
So that's really your debt servicing cost. It's all going to repayment of interest.
Yeah, and
So-
I think also, sorry, Bruce,
Over.
the fact that the minister said that they couldn't increase tax rates because of the economy suffering, we couldn't increase revenue. So, and whatever's on the table, if it's implemented, will not make up for that deficit.
So we're sitting here with a debt servicing cost of 6 billion, around about 6 billion.
Yes.
And Now, I think the viewer wants to know, what does that mean for the man on the street?
So what that means is that, I mean, obviously that will continue, because you will have to make up that 6 or 6.5 billion every year, right? So what that practically means is that the government will have continue borrowing every year, because you will have to make it up somewhere. I mean, you're spending more than what's coming in the kitty. So increase in debt, which will obviously subsequently increase your interest or servicing costs that we were speaking about. So it's really a vicious cycle which I think will continue in the foreseeable future.
Understood. But I need to understand for the man on the street, what does it mean?
Just in addition to that, Bruce, so if the money that you're raising through debt is literally going to your debt servicing costs, that means that you have little revenue left to place into your social expenditure within the country or developmental or whatever it may be. So if what you have, you paying off your debt, then you have literally almost nothing to stimulate growth, which is, I think, what the minister has highlighted.
So borrowing, but it doesn't go to revenue generating projects. It doesn't go to the to minister. What is it, to Minister of Health for the hospitals? And this influences the man on the street.
And maybe just to look at the numbers. I mean, they're looking at your GDP only increasing by 4%, I think, on average. And if you look at your debt, they're projecting on average to grow about 8.4%. That's double where your economic growth is coming from. So again, it just shows that your spending is much more prioritized on repaying debt than necessarily stimulating growth within the economy. And I think that will continue adding significant pressure on the general public.
Okay.
And in future, maybe, I don't know, eventually tax rates will increase to make up. So most probably next year, I don't know, we'll see an increase in tax rates.
So I think the viewer has a point, looking at higher debt levels, but not necessarily debt that you incur so that you can put that to productive use.
Yes.
Earning more revenue so that can then be plowed back. But this is more just servicing the current one.
Yes.
Because it's also important to service your debt. So from a household point of view.
Absolutely, Bruce. The point from a household perspective is, if I have a deficit in my budget, I need to get more income, or I need to incur less expenses, or both. And we know how difficult that is. So how do you cut? You actually need to cut your lifestyle expenses. And the main thing from this perspective is that there's about 6 billion which could have gone to productive use for the development of the economy. If you look at the debt service number per year, obviously we still have debt. But if we can decrease that, then more of that money can go into development. And the other thing is, if you look from a household perspective, you want to build equity from the assets you have. So if you don't build equity, which is a decrease in your deficit or increase in your surplus, then you cannot expand. Because how do you build, for instance, a property portfolio? If you look at a household, you need to have equity in your existing properties, and how do you get to that? The value of your assets need to increase. So you need to actually, if it's not increasing in itself, you need to decrease the liability on that.
Right.
And how do you decrease liability? If you're in a deficit, then you can actually not survive. And so in a sense, it's moving 2 steps ahead, but 3 backwards. And that's the first thing we need to learn.
I can hear the corporate investment banker coming through here. Let me also give the public a chance to say something. Now, I have a long question here, so let's look at it. In terms of our debt to GDP ceiling, is this something that is legally promulgated or incorporated into our laws and regulations? Or is the 35% merely a benchmark based on country-to-country comparisons? Is it perhaps not time to compel Parliament to enact this into the State Finance Act so that accountability for debt management of the country can be better enforced if it has legal backing in our legislation? So first of all, is this something that's been, is it a legal, as the viewer says, legal promulgated or incorporated into our laws, this 35%? Is it okay? Go for it.
If I look at the 35%, I think we wanted to set ourselves a benchmark that we didn't want to breach. But it doesn't seem like we're really living towards the benchmark that we have set for ourselves. So like Megamena had mentioned in the beginning, he said, it seems like now we're chasing the 60% benchmark of SADC, which is our fellow regional countries. But, and I mean, if you look at the numbers, it seems like we even breach, in the years to come, we could breach the 60% level of debt to GDP. So I think it's about time that we really look at our increasing level of debt to GDP. And obviously, I think we should take this as new normal. I'm not seeing us really getting back to the 35% level, or otherwise we have to up the target. But this is certainly the new normal.
I'm just mindful of the time, so Megameno, quickly.
Yeah. I'm speaking on the correction, but I surely don't believe that it's not a legal requirement. It's a internal ambition that we have set. But obviously, I think we're starting to hear less of that and more of 60% decided budget, which is obviously, I think, negative. Because, I mean, we also comparing ourselves to countries that have better and bigger revenue generation capacity. So, yeah, perhaps we must relook at it and probably up it to 45%, because, I mean, the minister is talking about debt to GDP stabilizing around about 52, level. So, yeah.
It seems like we're running out of time, so I quickly want to ask you a question on the business environment, because we've been hearing about the business environment not being conducive to businesses. So talk to us a little bit about that, and just in terms of what you heard in the budget, is that something that you see will change and get better?
I didn't see a lot of incentives for the business environment. We know the businesses are under pressure, and we also know that we have global pressures that's coming to the front. But what I can say is, in terms of there's opportunities for independent power producers, which came out of the budget, which was a positive thing. And the Whistleblowers Act will be implemented, which I think probably will have a curbing on corruption, which may also have a positive effect on foreign investors. And then the Public Enterprise Governance Bill will probably be approved. So there can be better controls in that regard, Bruce.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I can just add on that, I think the business community and investors, to a certain extent, what they want in this current economic time is certainty. Certainty around policies. And again, I think what we're seeing in the budget is, again, further delay of, specific policies that can determine whether you want to put your capital to use or not. And I think, so we need to get certainty around policies and certainty around even the tax amendments. So, and again, I mean, as an investor, you're looking at and saying, do I deploy my capital? But I don't really know the environment that I'm going to operate in. Once I know that, then I'll play to what's on the table.
Okay. I have to cut this discussion short. In fact, there's a lot of other things that I wanted to touch on. But maybe just as a last question, and maybe use that also as closing remarks. The corruption. Corruption was mentioned, but it seemed like it was just sort of in passing in saying that we must stop corruption. Is that something that we need to look at and have specific measures in place? Right. Maybe 30 seconds quickly on that one.
Maybe just to start with, and I guess this also ties in with accountability in corruption, because if you look at it and somebody does something wrong, and I remember we did a survey as well, just to the general public, what should be done if somebody commits some of these things. And it seems like the public is also now frustrated that corruption continues to be an upward and no one is really doing anything about it. I think for me it's more about punishing the person if they continuously do the same thing. And I mean, that's why accountability should be enacted. Okay. If you have accountability, then of course you would know who has led or contributed to this corruption, and therefore you take the necessary measures that needs to be taken.
Great. All right, Megameno, unfortunately I have to cut short our discussion. It's been a good discussion, and there are a lot of other things that we haven't touched upon. So I hope that we've addressed at least the revenue part of the budget and the expenditure part of the budget. So ladies and gentlemen, it is not easy formulating the budget of a country, especially when expenditure needs to increase and revenue cannot keep up. It still seems that we are prone to believe that we can spend our way out of our current situation, that somehow the revenue will appear to fund such expenditure. Now, this budget proposes to make money available to buy things, and these things should improve all our lives. That is what the Minister has said. However, we must do that honestly, diligently, with the common good as our only objective in mind. Now, this is a tall order, especially where we come from and where we are currently. We must inspect what we expect. Greater accountability from public officials who are the custodians of our public funds. Many solutions have been discussed and many opinions raised over the last many years, but someone must make a decision and action on the eloquent words we are using, get to a point where we address the issues head on, bite the bullet, tightening the belts, and carrying the load together. This forum will keep monitoring the budget implementation and provide regular feedback. I would like to thank my panel, Britt, Mega, Eddie, and Indaleni for their contributions. For those of you who have tweeted, and also thank you to all our viewers. May you have a restful evening. Good evening.